Hello viewers and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm pleased to present you with 3 exceptionally exciting new card spoilers from the upcoming Planetfall cycle of war packs. Each of these cards happens to belong to the Space Marines faction, and each was unveiled during the 22nd episode of the First Planet podcast. So a tremendous thanks to not only Fantasy Flight Games for providing our community with these exciting new spoilers in the first place, but also much obliged to both Brian and Scott for giving me the images I use in this video today. But without further ado, here's an introduction to and my initial impressions of each of our new and soon-to-be upcoming cards. First up, we have the Lone Wolf, an army unit with a printed cost of 3, 1 command icon, a loyal icon, an attack value of 3, and 3 hit points. It has the Soldier and Space Wolves traits and reads action. Exhaust this unit to move it to a target planet with an enemy warlord and without any units you control. So, the price of this unit seems fair given its printed statistics. It's a formidable defender, a powerful attacker, and it contributes to or could even win you some command struggles. But importantly, it affords you a rather unique opportunity to harass, seriously damage, outright bloody, or even kill the enemy warlord. For instance, let's say that you've finished the deploy phase with a weak, vulnerable, albeit command icon-laden unit sitting alone at a planet. If you have a lone wolf played out anywhere on the board, all of a sudden your opponent has one additional daunting variable to consider in regard to where they send their warlord during the command phase. Under normal circumstances, they might want to send their warlord to the same planet as your vulnerable, lonely unit. In order to win that planet's command struggle, assassinate your unit, trigger that planet's potentially beneficial battle ability, and of course, subsequently bounce back to the safety of their HQ. Should they choose to send their warlord to that planet without any units commit alongside as backup, you can simply exhaust your lone wolf, transfer it to that planet, and suddenly, although they still might be able to kill off your command unit, if they want to chance potentially triggering that planet's battle ability, they'll have to deal with your lone wolf first. And as soon as the second round of combat begins and it readies, they'll have to deal with an incoming swing of 3 unless they happen to retreat. And given that the lone wolf has 3 hit points, unless your opponent's warlord happened to have indeed arrived with a retinue of other army units, or perhaps they have their signature attachment affixed. For instance, the Swarm Lord reaches 3 attack value the moment he equips his Bone Sabers. That moderate HP value of 3 can nevertheless prove a bit difficult to chew through, even if you opt not to shield or use Indomitable to your advantage, particularly if your opponent happens to be playing a warlord like the 1 attack value Commander Shadow Sun. And of course, I think it's definitely worth considering that whenever an opponent leaves their warlord open, a traditional tried-and-true established Space Marine tactic is to respond with a timely eager recruit or drop pod assault. And though whatever unit you bring into play may not end up bloodying the opponent's warlord by itself or otherwise forcing a retreat, if you can back up that drop-podded unit or recruit with a lone wolf, that's suddenly far more likely to convince your opponent to abandon that planet, and the moment they do so, they forego the opportunity of winning that combat, and suddenly you're the player that gets to trigger that battle ability. And it's certainly worth noting that the lone wolf itself can be brought into play through a drop pod assault. Plus, I think another fantastic opportunity to back up your ambush units would happen to occur near the end of the battle. For example, if all of your units end up killed off, perhaps by a very narrow margin of enemy victory, you simply use an action to shift in the lone wolf, then play an eager recruit and/or drop pod assault, and with those card effects all combined together, I think it makes your opponent's odds of victory far thinner indeed. And given that Ragnar Blackmane in particular tends to be very first planet aggressive, it's by all means worth considering that if your lone wolf is left unexhausted at the end of combat at the first or one of the first few planets, prior to your winning that battle, he can shift further down the line, so long as his destination does happen to be at a planet where you control no units, which serves to ensure that he's ready for the following round's combat, or, though he does arrive exhausted, that he'll be able to participate in a future battle during that same game round. You just want to make sure that if you have the choice, he's not one of your units left exhausted by the time that early planet combat concludes. And although he only has one command icon, his ability should be used after he has already made his still worthwhile significant contribution during the command phase. But if you want, you could affix a copy of Promotion in order to make him an all the more respectable, still rather resilient and relocatable command unit. Or you could also play Ragnar's War Camp and watch your opponents suddenly become very nervous about the prospect of sending their warlord to a planet where you either don't control any units or are otherwise likely not to once your enemy warlord has managed to snipe off one of your command units. And if you want, although it's at this point starting to become staggeringly expensive, you could always mix or match a Frostfang in as well, for all the more added incentive for your opponent to either retreat or avoid certain planets entirely. But whenever the lone wolf does show up to a planet, given that it arrives late, it might get to avoid an area effect volley or gleeful plague beast's reaction entirely. And the fact that these lone wolves can potentially participate in multiple combats each and every game round is indeed pretty spectacular. So, a shame that they're loyal for sure, and definitely unfortunate that they need be exhausted in order to trigger their ability. But the fact that they happen to be soldiers gives Ragnar Blackmane all the more reason to ally with Astra Militarum, just so that when one of these dies, you could potentially put up to 3 copies of Elysian Assault Team into play as well. So, perhaps a bit expensive at first glance, perhaps ultimately not worth it in the long term, but I think that these guys could, perhaps, potentially prove to be deceptively powerful, especially if we happen to see more Space Marine faction eligible readying effects, anything along the lines of Vengeance or Kato's Stronghold. But next up, we happen to have seen spoiled a second army unit, and this time not a Vika Finrika, but rather a Black Templar. We have the 2-cost Righteous Initiate with 1 command icon, an attack value of 1, and 2 hit points. It has the Soldier and Black Templar's traits, as well as the Unstoppable specialization, stating, the first time this unit is assigned damage this round, prevent 1 of that damage, and this unit gets +2 attack until the end of the phase. So, in a sense, this unit strikes me as a bit of a gamble. From a vanilla perspective, it's somewhat expensive relative to its printed stats, but it's fairly easy to keep alive during battle, because even without the benefit of 1 or more shield cards, it takes a swing of 3 in order to kill it outright. And with the benefit of shield cards, if you can keep it alive for multiple combat rounds, it can potentially attack for 3 be more than once. Note also, of course, that to trigger that specialization, it needs to be assigned damage instead of actually taking or receiving any. So just like the Lone Wolf, I think this could potentially be a great opportunity to really punish your opponent for overextension of their warlord, especially if they're playing someone like Commander Shadowsun who only has one printed attack value. But in any case, I think this unit is really going to come into its own once we see Chaplain Mavros released, because the instant you happen to be fighting with the Righteous Initiate at a blue planet, you can simply trigger Chaplain Mavros's ability on demand, which would result in your assigning 1 point of damage to this army unit, boosting its attack value by 1, and then its unstoppable specialization kicks in, which immediately prevents that 1 damage and further augments its attack value by 2. So that means this 2-cost unit would suddenly be attacking for 4 until the end of the phase. And if you want, you could choose to trigger Mavros's ability twice in a row without the fear of outright killing this 2 HP army unit. And if it just so happens that you can manage to pull off something like the event Vengeance, perhaps after your Righteous Initiate is exhausted and an opponent decides to attack and kill off one of your other still ready army units, then the more times you can benefit from that single boosted attack value, the better. So overall, perhaps not terribly fancy, but there's certainly quite a lot to like. And once players start running the Neophyte Apprentice, another as of yet unreleased 1-cost Space Marines army unit, which has a forced reaction which necessitates that the Apprentice replace itself with an up to 4-cost Black Templar unit fetched from the top 6 cards of your deck upon its managing to successfully deal damage to an enemy unit through an attack, then this seems to me like a Black Templar Warlord auto-include. And last but not least, the final card spoiled by the First Planet podcast happens to be the event Accept Any Challenge. It has a cost of 1 shield icon, and the tactic and vow traits. It reads Reaction. After you win a battle at a technology planet, blue, draw a card for each Black Templar's unit you control at that planet. Max 1 per round. So, this is a card with power entirely dependent upon the total number of Black Templar units that end up being designed, printed, and subsequently seeing play. It costs more resources than does Primal Howl, but it's easier to trigger. Instead of hoping you commit your warlord to the same planet as your opponents, you simply win a battle and you can draw a card for each and every Black Templar unit you still control at that planet, which includes your warlord. So, if you're playing Chaplain Mavros, and frankly, I think this card is unlikely to see play before our Black Templar Warlord is released, this could potentially reel you in a ton of cards, and I can think of no better way to overcome that Packmaster Kith card choke. If you're being extremely aggressive and pushing the First Planet hard, you could potentially end up with a tremendous number of units all stacked upon one another, and though you of course leave yourself quite open to Doom or Warp Storm in doing so, if you have 1 or more copies of the Righteous Initiate, Neophyte Apprentice, Reclusium Templars, and or the Emperor's Champion, and of course all alongside Chaplain Mavros, then you could potentially be accruing an enormous wealth of cards that in all likelihood might end up being worth that very risk. And especially considering that Mavros himself is at his utmost powerful when battle is indeed taking place at a blue technology icon possessing planet, whether or not your warlord actually happens to be present there, then this seems like an absolute Black Templar staple. So it's definitely a shame that Mavros himself won't actually end up being released until the 5th war pack of the Planetfall cycle, but if I wasn't excited headed for that warlord already. I definitely consider myself such now, and I very much look forward to each and every one of our 3 upcoming Decree of Ruin previewed cards. But now that we've covered each of our exciting new spoilers, I'll just conclude this video by saying thank you once again to Fantasy Flight Games for providing our community with these previews, and of course to both Brian and Scott of the First Planet podcast for sending me the images I used in this video today. So, as always, if you enjoyed this content, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, you're always encouraged to share these videos, as the more people there are that stumble upon this content, the more people end up exposed to Conquest. They might give the game a try, they might like what they see, and for all we know, they might end up joining our community, and of course, each and every dollar spent on Conquest is a message sent to Fantasy Flight Games to continue to support this fantastic product. If at any point you'd like to get in touch with me, feel free to do so through Twitter or through Facebook, and of course, if at any point you'd like to donate $1 or $2 to me a month, I'd be both honored and humbled were you to visit my Patreon to help me cover some of my file hosting and operating expenses. But once again, I'll just say thank you so much for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.